I think that's part of grief. We name it, we identify it, we feel the feelings, and then we figure out how to go forward by what can we do in this next season that's new, not replacing or diminishing, what we're missing.
Chase the why. So part of understanding our grief is understanding, why is this hitting me the way it is? What about it am I missing? What about it am I mourning? Have I lost?
Welcome to the Midlife Moms podcast, where you'll find tips, encouragement, and resources to help you thrive in the midlife. Join us on Instagram at Midlife Moms Podcast or our Facebook group, Midlife Moms Community.
Welcome to the Midlife Moms podcast. My name is Amelia Rhodes. I'm your co-host, and joining me today is my friend, fellow author, Brenda Yoder. Welcome, Brenda.
Good morning, everyone.
We're so glad you're here, and we are excited about our topic today. We just love chatting with you, and we're so glad you take time out of your day to join us. And today we're going to be talking about grief and all of the things that we grieve in this stage of life. And I know it's weird to start with laughter when our topic is grief, but as we start every episode, we want to talk about what's making us laugh, because laughter matters. And even in grief, if you've been through a season of grieving or loss, laughter is important, and it is part of the grieving and healing process to be able to laugh in the midst of the hard things. And so, Brenda, what's making you laugh these days?
Well, if you are watching this on our YouTube channel, you'll see that I have my happy camper sweatshirt on. It's a new one that I bought actually at what I refer to as Old Lady Store, that I love to go to sift through the clothes that I think I'm not going to wear that until I'm older, but found one that I could wear that says Happy Camper. My husband and I bought our own little new camper. That's our little midlife thing that we've done. And so I wear this to make myself happy. So I have to laugh at myself because I'm in denial that I would be in that store. Anyway,
I've been in that store, and it's very funny. I love it. Well, I love your Happy Camper sweatshirt and your little camper, and it's almost camping season. We're getting there. That's something to be happy about.
Yes, it is.
So what's making me laugh?
Yes, what's making you laugh?
So I got together with some girls that I know the past week, and I still call them my girls, even though we're all entering midlife. And we were just chatting about family situations and getting caught up in each other's lives. And one of the gals was talking about, a scenario with, her parents, which we could all relate to. And she said something that we all just chuckled about. We'd been talking about how you enter this phase of life where suddenly you're the logical one and you're the parent to your parents. And she said, who would have thought my teenager listens to me better than my dad does? And we just all kind of laughed around the table, because we'd all been there at some point in time where you're trying to explain to your parents something and they're just not getting it, but your teenager does. So it was just kind of some humor in the midst of some hard stuff.
Which is exactly what we're going to be doing today. We're going to be talking about some of the hard stuff, but I think, Amelia, we've talked before about this stage of life. Sometimes you either have to laugh or you have to cry. And sometimes our hormones bring up a lot of tears. And so actually that was just one thing another friend and I were just talking about yesterday, was how the stage of life has so many things that make us feel vulnerable and so many losses, but then the hormones on top of that just make it even more, because some days we just feel like we're going to cry and we don't know what we're going to cry about.
The thing that I thought is so unfair about the states of life, and it makes me laugh, is the fact that we're going through all of these hormone changes probably about the same time maybe that our kids are. And it just really is not fair. Yeah. And you kind of have to laugh about it. And then you realize, okay, I get it. They're feeling a little out of control. I am too.
Yeah, the words, so I work at an elementary school, so we always talk about big feelings, right? For the real little kids, we talk about them having big feelings, and so they'll call a counselor, so-and-so's having big feelings today, and so maybe that just needs to be our mantra is, I'm a midlife mom having some big feelings today.
I love that. I'm totally going to start using that. Mom is just having some big feelings today, so give her a little bit of space. I love it. So as we talk about grief, in your book, Brenda, Fledge, which is a great handbook and guide and resource for women in this phase of life, you have a whole chapter and section on mom grief that I found very encouraging and made me feel not so alone. And we do want to mention that chapter is available for free download and listening. Is it the audio chapter that's available, Brenda?
It is the audio chapter that's available.
We will link to that in the show notes, but you can find it at heraldpress.com/books/fledge. And I encourage you to go listen to it because it's a great resource and you will feel encouraged and not alone as we talk about mom grief. And that's one of the things that you share and talk about, Brenda, is mom grief. And tell us a little bit about what we're going through.
Sure. So I first realized that this was a thing when I wrote a blog post and I titled it Mom Grief. And it was even before I wrote Fledge, even had an idea about a book about that, but was experiencing all of these losses myself. And I wrote this blog post and got a lot of feedback from it on Facebook, and a lot of women who were in kind of my phase of life, maybe having their nest empty already, really identified, yes, that's how I felt. And the more I started kind of sifting through that, it really was grief. This really was grief that I was experiencing. And when I wrote the chapter called You've Got Mom Grief, I really kind of listed all the different types of grief. So I'm just kind of going to jump through them because there are several, and some on the outset you wouldn't think about. But so one of them is actually missing your child or your children. So
I can relate. I
Yeah.
can relate. Like they're teenagers, and sometimes you look at them and you see, oh, there's the 4-year-old. Oh, sometimes for me, it's too realizing I should have appreciated it more. Like I didn't realize, I thought it was hard then. And you talk about this, missing your child or children. Kedron found me, my husband found me months ago. I was sifting through old videos and he finds me in the kitchen just like weeping. And he's like, why are you crying? I'm like, I thought it was hard then. I had no idea how hard it was really going to get.
Yeah. There's a picture that's circulating out there of a little toddler pulling this big suitcase. And I think the caption is, this is how every mom feels about their child who's walking out the door. And it really is true. You know, when your children leave for their first job or for college or their first apartment, you truly do see them through the eyes of that toddler, that younger child who literally has grown up before your eyes. And so I think for a lot of women in the fledging stage of when your children do start leaving, from the time that first one leaves into the last one does, you physically miss your kids.
Mm-hmm.
And there was one time where my husband and I were coming home from a conference together. He went with me while I spoke at a conference. And I just remember telling him, I said, it's not that I don't want to spend time with you, but it's just that my heart aches some days. It literally misses my children.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's a given. But there's another type of grief that is far behind that, which is something I really struggled with. Maybe not all women do this, but a grief of prior stages of family life.
Mm-hmm.
Like junior high, I don't miss that stage at all, but so I don't envy you right now. I know you've got a middle schooler right now, but I truly had a loss for the younger years. I would say like age 8 and under. And for a long time, I wanted a tag along child because I still wanted to have those younger kids. And so that's just something I grieved.
Mm-hmm.
So Amelia, is there any stage of childhood that you have missed as your children have gotten older?
Part of me thinks I'm still so caught up in the middle of it that I don't know what I miss yet. But I do miss that kind of cuddly stage of between, like you were saying, that under 8, where everything is just funny and goofy, and the silliness, the freedom to be silly without the awkwardness of what do people think, or what are they going to think about me or judge, that freedom that they had at that younger age to just be their full goofy self.
Yeah, I love that. And because it really does highlight, I think, the complexity of raising kids as they get older.
Mm-hmm.
They really start being affected by kind of what's going on around them. So that brings another loss, kind of that loss of youth and that loss of even bearing children. So I know for me, that was tied to this missing the stages of life. But when I was your age, when I was in my early 40s, I still really struggled with wanting to have another child. And the more that I sifted through it, it really was probably tied more to missing that ability to bear children. Not necessarily that I wanted to bear children anymore, I think, but there's something about still having the ability, having your menstrual cycle, being able to bear children, that physically and I think symbolically and maybe in the intrinsic world of being a woman is the representation of I'm still alive, I'm still youthful, I can still birth life.
Mhm.
I don't know. That's just me. Maybe not all. I've heard women that have said, no way. I was done having kids at, 32 or whatever, and I've never looked back since.
And that would be me. And I think that's the thing to recognize is we all have different types of mom grief. And some of these might strike you and some of them might not. And to recognize too that wherever we are, we're all in this together. We're all women. And a lot of my grief is different. I did not miss babies and toddlers. I did not miss being pregnant or having the ability to be pregnant. And I was one of those that I had my first child at 28, second one right before 30. And that was it, done, easy decision, no looking back. And to recognize that we're each uniquely wired and gifted in different ways. And if you grieve this, that's fine. If you don't grieve that, that's okay. Like embracing how God has wired you, that you may not grieve something, and that's okay too.
Right. And also the acknowledgement that the grief doesn't always stay there. So I have said a lot in the last probably 3 years since my youngest has gone to college, has graduated and gone to college, is there's no way, like, I'm really glad I don't have a tag along now because I'm done. Like when I was done parenting him, when he went to college, I was done. A flip switched or a switch flipped in me. No more grief, no more grief about having those younger ones. But
I think that's something to note too, is that you will move through it. Even as we list this and talk about it, you might be in this phase of, oh, I do remember at one point in time, I did grieve that. And that we don't get stuck there. And this is something we'll talk about as we wrap up the episode. But wherever you are, know that you won't stay there forever.
for sure. And then so we talked about the next type of grief a little bit on the last episode, and that's the grief of regret. And there's
Right.
a lot of different types of regret. What are some of the types of regret that you see that women struggle with during this stage of life?
Regret, there's marriage regret, of maybe where their marriage is or isn't. There's regret of the time they had available for their kids or didn't have, regret of choices that they made or didn't make. Regret in vocation and career, whether they stayed home or didn't stay home, or where they are or aren't in their career. It's just this season of evaluating, wow, here I am at this midpoint, all the things that you maybe wish you had that you didn't.
Yeah, and I know for myself, I shared a little bit of my story last episode about when I hit 40, I left my teaching career because I had failed a lot in a lot of ways. I didn't handle my stress well. I was a very critical, and I was a parent who yelled for several years. And when I really came out of that stage, and I went through a period of grief, like I literally cried, I think, as I mourned what I could have done differently. And there's part of grief and grief of regret that comes to the place where we have to acknowledge it. And if we need to turn from it, repent from it, change whatever it is we need to change, but then also acknowledge that we did the best we could at the time with what we knew.
Absolutely.
That was something that a friend of mine and I were talking about just the other day also. Even with our adult children, we can see patterns in our adult children's lives that we take on, like, oh, did I contribute to that, or is that my fault? And I think we just have to hold some of those things loosely.
And that key of you did the best with what you knew is so important, because as we get older and wiser, we grow and mature, and there are things like, well, I would not go back and do that again. But in your 20s, 30s, that's what you knew and you did the best. And to know that God is with you and he redeems those things. I think you said last episode, redeems the years the locust has lost, and not to stay stuck there in the coulda, shoulda, woulda, but looking forward to how God will continue to move.
Right. So then there's the grief that you've just mentioned, the grief of the life that you should have or you could have had. And then there's grief of actual loss. So during this stage of life, a lot of people lose their parents to death, and also grieve children that have died. Perhaps, have you've miscarried or had stillborns or had an infant who died or even a child who died. I think as I was talking to moms about this topic when I was writing Fledge, I heard one mom say that, every milestone as um, as the peers of her would-be child he reached those milestones like graduation, doing all those things, she relives those milestones with grief of who her child would be if they were alive and experiencing those things.
Those are heavy, heavy burdens to carry. And I think the thing about grief is sometimes it takes you by surprise. You're not even thinking about it. And something like that, a memory, or you see someone else experiencing what you would have been experiencing, it just takes you over and you're unprepared for it.
Yeah. And I think we've talked before, and I'm sure this will be a podcast episode about being in the sandwich generation of kind of caring for your parents and then also having your kids. And we've lost 3 out of our 4 children, or 3 out of our 4 parents to death already. And I know that I grieved for a long time my children not having those grandparents present in their life. And so that was something that I grieved just even as a parent too.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So there's just lots of things that make us cry. And we mentioned hormones. So we've got hormones on top of grief. And I just want to say that this whole idea of grief just came to me when my third one was leaving for college. So I was in my my later 40s, and we had 2 kids who had been out of the house already in college, and our third one was going to college. And I just was stuck. I was stuck and almost crying almost his whole senior year, even though I still had a freshman in high school. And it was all of that weepiness and that crying and the hormones and realizing that I was stuck. I was looking back at what was, and I was dreading what was coming forward. And that's when I just had to name it. And so as I've talked with other women, naming grief is really important. But there's other losses we have though that really impact us from our own story. And Amelia, you've experienced some grief that came unexpected for you. You want to share a little bit about that?
I did. And it was not something that I would have ever thought would hit me like this. But several years ago, my parents entered a new phase of life. My dad had an unexpected retirement a little early that he did not look for. And when he decided to accept that, my parents decided to do something that they had always wanted to do that I didn't realize they'd always wanted to do. But they sold their home and they moved into an RV. And so we never lived in the same state even after I graduated from high school. They were in Ohio, I was in Michigan. So we had always had this not constant relationship through my adulthood. We would come home at holidays, and then they left my hometown and moved to another city. So this home that they were leaving, this city that they were leaving, was not my home. It wasn't the house I grew up in. It wasn't the city I grew up in. It wasn't the church I grew up in. So I felt like I'd already kind of grieved and moved past they left the hometown, they left the family home long time ago, decades ago. And so when they moved and they downsized, I was like, happy for them. They were entering an adventure they were excited about, a time of ministry. They still have their youth and their energy, and what they're doing is phenomenal. They're serving organizations and they're doing a lot of great, something they've always wanted to do. So that first holiday that came around was Thanksgiving, and they were, I don't remember, somewhere else. And we would have gone home for that. Not my home, but their home. And all of a sudden it hit me, there's no more going home. There's no more holidays at their house. There's no more propping back in the recliner and letting mom take care of everything. Because I would do that at the exhausted phase of life. We'd go over spring break or the holidays and I'd be like, oh, I will help. But there was this sense of ease and comfort of just being in their home and being the one who's doing most of the cooking and I'm helping clean up, So it was just this all of a sudden realization that I'm like, why is this hitting me so hard? Because I never lived in this home. I never lived in this city, but it was all of the memories that we had built in that home, in that city with our kids. Mm-hmm. That was what hit me. That was grandma and grandpa's house that they knew. These were the things that, and all of a sudden I realized we're never going to do this again. We have no reason to come back to this city. We have no reason to ever come back to this zoo. We will not spend a week in their RV with them. It's not big enough. And so it was this process that really shook me for a little bit, a few weeks, a few months. It was all of those firsts in that first year of establishing new things. And I think that's part of grief. And one of the things that you teach on is we name it, we identify it, we feel the feelings, and then we figure out how to go forward by what can we do in this next season that's new, not replacing or diminishing, what we're missing. But for us, it was, okay, we're gonna have a whole new set of memories in this next phase of life with them. It will be new activities, new adventures, and it will look completely different than it did before, but that doesn't mean it has to be bad, all bad, or bad at all.
Right. No, you've explained it. I think you've explained things that I want to encourage our listeners to listen to on both ends. So I know that we have some listeners that are maybe going through those things because their parents maybe are in their 60s or even 70s and kind of doing that change and retiring. But we also have parents who are, or moms who are listening, who are empty nesters, who are at midlife, who are changing part of their home routine and some things like that. And this is what I've learned as a daughter, but then who's also a parent, is that as we grow and change, how we do that does affect our kids. And so
Right.
it kind of comes back, it's on both sides. And that's part of that midlife thing, is we're ready to move and grow and change, but those changes affect our children too. And I know for our own story, we were doing some updates in one of our children's bedrooms, and we weren't able to tell them in the way that we had wanted to before they came home from a break, and it really kind of surprised them. And it was like, wait a minute, this doesn't feel like home. And so that's one thing I've even learned with my children as they leave home, is that to talk about their needs for when they come home. Like, what do you need when you come home? Because yeah, home is, well, that's another episode probably. So let's just stay at grief. But there's a lot that you identified that I think is so relevant for both who we are as parents, but then also who we are as children too, because we're experiencing all those things together.
Mm-hmm.
You talked about naming it and feeling it. And one thing I often tell people is to chase the why. So part of understanding our grief is understanding, why is this hitting me the way it is?
Right.
What about it am I missing? What about it am I mourning? Have I lost? And sometimes that's a person. So if you're grieving, like for me, one example I shared the other day when I was speaking on grief was one of my children's grandparents died when they were fairly young. And I grieved my mother-in-law for a long time. And I finally had to come to the place where, what was about her that I wanted to take into my children's lives?
Mm-hmm.
Because two of my children didn't know her. They were so young when she died. So making meaning from our grief, or making meaning, taking whatever it is from the person or the feeling, the time of life that you loved so much, that meant so much to you. What about that can you bring into your current life? And that's just, it's such a practical way, but it really is one of the ways to not feel like we have exclusively lost something that was so meaningful and important to us.
It's so important. And as I've gone through this journey with my parents, over the past few years, I named it, but then I did, getting to the why is so important. Because I was like so confused by it. What is it that I'm missing? And I had to think about it for a while before I got to, it's my kids and the memories and those experiences, those routines and patterns that we had that we will no longer have. So naming it and identifying the why was so freeing, I have to say.
Right. And I think about mom grief in particular. And, for myself, like I said, I grieved the younger stages. In fact, this is maybe a funny I should have shared earlier. Probably about 3 Christmases ago, I'm so embarrassed to say this, but Ferdinand the Bull was out as a movie. And that was a book that my husband read to our kids every night at bedtime, and he'd made all the sounds and they just laughed. Well, it came out and I was like, we have to go see this movie. So my kids are like in high school, college, out of college, and then even more out of college. And they're like, Mom, that's a kid movie. I'm like, no, it meant so much to us. So I made my kids go see this movie when none of them wanted to. And it was completely me being that old mom who's holding on to something that I was not ready yet to let go. And so they joke about that now, but a year later, I was at a completely different place. But for that year, I was still holding on to that. And I do want to encourage all moms that that's part of the struggle. Part of the struggle is, for the sake of our children getting older and growing, we have to let go. And that's where I need my group of moms, like here in the podcast, or on the Facebook group that we have, where moms can gather together, is we need each other so that we can lament and we can grieve, so that we aren't putting it on our children.
Okay, I'm totally laughing because I have to tell you now my funny movie mom story that we just did within the past year. So one of those stages of life that was so fun was that 5, 6, 4, 5, 6, 7. And my kids, my daughter in particular, had a Dora the Explorer phase that I thought was going to last forever. And then my son comes along and it's Dora and Diego. And that defines, I don't know, a good 5 years of our life. And so there was a Dora the Explorer movie that came out, a live action with some animated characters. And my husband and I, we made the kids watch it with us. I don't know, it was on Netflix or something. And they were like, seriously, this is a little kid movie. Why are you making us watch this? And we're like, because this was your childhood. And he and I are singing along to the movie, and they are just rolling their eyes and groaning the whole time. But we just needed to get it out of our system and relive that moment of, this is, you're grown up now, but this was your childhood. And then we did joke of like, okay, you subjected us to like 5 years of this. You can watch one movie for an hour.
Right. But that's just so true. And I think you mentioned something that I think we just, as we wind up this episode, want to give moms permission to do, which is, sometimes you do have to feel it. Sometimes you do just have to like, go down and, look through your box of Barbies or toys or whatever it is that's your kids. For me, it's children's books, or just go in their room. And I think that's part of it. There was a scene that I use in one of the chapters of Fledge, but it was one that caught me by surprise, was the empty rooms. And so when our youngest was even still home, when he was still in college, or I'm sorry, when our youngest was still in high school, we have all of our bedrooms are upstairs for the kids, and then ours is downstairs. So we have 4 bedrooms whose doors all just face each other. And I went upstairs for something quickly, and I turned around and just saw empty rooms, and I just sobbed. And it really is that emptiness, I think, is what is part of that grief process. And it's a bridge to fill your life with things that I think when you're parenting and your kids, when you have your hands on your kids all the time, every single day that like life is there with you, and they're the most important thing to you. And when you have your hands on them physically, there's just something about feeling whole. And then as your kids leave, there's this emptiness that you just can't replace. It's something so tangible. So then to see it tangible. And for my husband and I, we've really had to work through that a little bit. We actually do rent those rooms out through Airbnb. So you can look up Picket Fence Farm on Airbnb, but we do run Airbnb when our children aren't here. And that's one of the reasons it actually makes me feel comforted, just to know that there's still life in the house in those areas.
That's an example of you took a loss and you're like, okay, what can we bring forward into the next phase and do? Kind of reinvented and brought something great from those empty rooms and filling them. And it's a blessing for those who are able to stay there.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
I think you identified kind of really where we want to land in our action step. And that is to name it and feel it and do something tangible if needed, wherever it is that you find yourself, whatever you are grieving, is to take some time in the next few days to sit with that, to name it to God, to feel it. And maybe it's something tangible of walking through rooms or going through a box of old photos or watching some old movies, just for the sake of reflecting. And I would incorporate with that some gratitude. Thank you for that season, and that we had that, and the good that you found in it. And so just take some time to do that, to feel it, name it, and do a little reflecting, maybe with a little bit of gratitude. And so,
Yeah. And I would just add too that to speak up for your needs. Your partner may not feel exactly the way you do. And that's just one thing also that I want to put in here right at the end is my husband and I have experienced our grief over the years differently. And so giving you and your spouse that grace of understanding that they may not be exactly where you are. But then just to be able to say it tonight, I just need to sit here and look at this box and cry.
so good. And I would love to close a little bit differently this time around, but in my book, Pray A to Z, I wrote a prayer for the grieving. And I would just love to share this with you and pray this over you. If you could just, wherever you are, just sit and soak this in, that we love you. God loves you, and whatever you are grieving, he sees you, and he is the comforter, and he will sit with you in that grief. And we didn't have a chance to talk about it, but the Bible provides a language for grief, and it's called lament. Brenda mentioned that. And in the book of Psalms, there are 150 Psalms, and about a third of those focus on lament. So we know this matters, that our grief matters, and it matters to God. And so I would love to pray this over you as we close out this episode. Psalm 34:18 says, "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit." Father, we bring to you those who are grieving. May all know you as the God of comfort, the God who sees, the God who never leaves us or forsakes us. May loving arms surround them, and in quiet moments alone, may they know you are still there. Help them not to stuff their emotions, but to feel them and move through the grief. Help them come to you in their lament with openness and honesty about their deep grief. Enable them to grieve at their own pace, to take care of themselves, and give them grace as they adjust to a new normal. Give their community wisdom to know when to reach out and when to give space. And may all who grieve know the joy that comes in the morning after a long time of darkness. Amen.
That is beautiful. Thank you so much for that.
Thanks for joining us all today, friends. We will see you next time.